Questions are swirling about Modi government's stimulus 2.0. Was this the best financial recovery package the central government could have crafted? Why has the government focused so heavily on lubricating the supply side of the economy, and why has the demand side stimulus not been given more attention? Will this five-part economic package help revive an economy in ICU, or is this, as the opposition alleges, just a glorified loan mailer? On Jumpstart today, we will debate the logic and the math of the government's stimulus 2.0. Principal Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance, Sanjeev Sanyal, will take questions and respond to arguments made by five leading economists. Has enough been done to keep the economy ventilated in the short term? Why did the government not accept the demand for direct cash transfers for poor migrants? I want to welcome first the top technocrat in the Finance Ministry, the Principal Economic Advisor, Sanjeev Sanyal. Sanjeev, welcome and thank you for agreeing to be in the hot seat. I want to introduce you now to the panel of economists and experts who will help deconstruct the government's financial aid package. Dr. Rathin is the director of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. He's worked across 80 countries on macroeconomics and fiscal policy. Professor Vikram Gandhi is a senior lecturer in the Entrepreneurial Management Unit of the Harvard Business School. He teaches investing, risk, return, and impact. Samiran Chakraborty is the managing director and chief economist of the Citi Group in India. And we have Pranjal Bhandari, chief economist at HSBC. Sanjeev, let's start with that one question that's been debated most often. Why did the Modi government not accept the demand for direct cash transfers to migrant workers? You obviously thought about it, you rejected it. Explain the economic philosophy at play given the kind of clamor this demand generated.
I think first of all what we need to do is to think through what this package really was doing. There were two elements to it. The one element was obviously on the supply side, which you just mentioned. There was a lot of things in there, an apologetic pitch for privatization, opening up of the agriculture sector, labor laws, opening up mining and so on. So there was a whole gamut of issues there. And then there was the issue about what to do about demand. In that context, we have indeed gone ahead and done a whole bunch of things for pumping cash through. By the way, that was there in the previous, in fact, the very first package included this. We have again come up with monies that shall be pumped through to, say, migrant workers who are stuck in the cities, for example, and can't raise grain because their ration cards are not there. So we have made arrangements for that. We've also made arrangements for enhanced Manrega, which is, we know that people are going back into the villages, so they need jobs there. So it's not as if we are not creating different avenues for cash to flow to the bottom of the pyramid. But we have to take into account one more thing, which is, in the end, while we can provide cash as a safety net, food as a safety net, and doing it directly, and by the way, we are willing to do more, we have to also take into account one important fact, that unless the business sector, particularly the MSMEs, do not have enough liquidity and cash with them, then we will have a serious jobs problem. So one of the things that we have aimed here is to make sure that this sector gets adequate amount of cash. And you know about the 3 lakh crores that we have given 100% guarantee. We've also created avenues to get money through to the NBFCs. So this was the idea. Now, this does not mean that we are not prepared to do more. And I think the finance minister has made that clear. This is not a sprint. It's a marathon, and we will consequently do it step by step.
But at this moment, there is a house that's on fire, and a lot of the five-part press conference was, when this house is rebuilt, this will be the structure, this will be the marble, this will be the granite. But was enough done, Dr. Rathin to address the principal issue of dousing the fire? The government says, through Manrega, through PDS and food grain distribution, we are ensuring that no one is dying of hunger. We're ensuring we can keep small companies afloat. That's a good start, and that's enough to begin with. Do you agree with the government's logic on not pushing through a cash transfer migrants at this moment, Dr. Rathin?
No, it's not a matter of agreeing with the government's logic or not. The question is there a logic? And the logic is there. the way I did, the government has decided in its wisdom, in my view, that it is a very good idea for the country to mobilize its resources and deploy them to sort of restart and maintain economic activity. But the government's not going to do it, at least for now. What the government will do tomorrow, we'll see. So what the government has said it will do is it will let people borrow. And it will facilitate that borrowing. In some cases, to be fair to government, guarantee it. But it's not going to be the government that's doing the borrowing, and that's probably what is meant by self-reliance. It's going to be businesses, people from their provident fund who are going to do the borrowing. Which is why people who are looking for a fiscal stimulus were disappointed. But to be fair to government, they never said that the stimulus would be a fiscal stimulus. The fiscal stimulus that they gave at the very beginning, in terms of some income support to these Jan Dhan accounts and allowing people to borrow from their provident fund and that sort of thing. So the mass of what the government has done in the present tense has been to say that segments of society, individuals, businesses, etc., who wish to borrow, we will make it easier for them to do so, and the RBI has backed that with liquidity. For the rest, the government has said what they will do tomorrow. I don't know what they were doing for the past 2 months. But about 25% of the pronouncements are X, Y, Z will happen. And then there are the reform packages, and they're all very good. But I don't really see what they have to do with COVID. I take the argument that this is a good time to push through reforms, but I wonder what that means. Does that mean that before COVID there were people who would not get hurt by reforms, or who would get hurt by reforms, and therefore there was political cost in doing so, and COVID opens up a political space?
Okay, so we'll come to that in just a bit. You're saying the government never said it will be a fiscal stimulus alone. It's a package that's been put out. Now I want to go across to Dr. Arvind Virmani, former Chief Economic Advisor. You've been in the hot seat in government. The government has explained at length that the options open in the future, but at this moment the key was to infuse liquidity, give credit to small companies so that they can be left standing at the end of the pandemic, and therefore we did not at this time feel the need to push ahead with direct cash transfers for migrants. Do you think that's compelling logic, Dr. Virmani?
Well, firstly, I should say, we've done research at the Foundation for Economic Growth over the last 2 months. And frankly, I'm very puzzled by this repeated call. I see it every day for the last 60 days on TV for a stimulus. We've been locked down for almost 2 months. And if you, and what our analysis showed was that 40% of the economy, which was essential commodities, was functioning. 60% was shut down. And as far as the essential commodities are concerned, there was more or less balance between demand and supply. For the rest of the economy, demand and supply were at zero. There could be no effective demand. So to me, this whole discussion of stimulus, less stimulus, large stimulus, small stimulus seems to be, I'm sorry to provoke, but seems to me from a different planet. Now, what were the key issues there? In the lockdown economy, when 60% of the economy is closed, okay, there were 3 main issues. One is what I call legal asymmetry, right? You are forcing producers to not produce and sell, but they still have to meet their legal obligations, whether it's rents, interest, debt repayment, etc., etc. So what you have is you will get large mass-scale bankruptcies, okay? The second part, of course, which has been endlessly discussed, we can discuss it later, but that was the first actually, it was not the second, was to make sure that those people who don't have assets to fall back on and who lost their jobs or lost their livelihood survive, So the 2 key issues were human survival and avoiding mass bankruptcies. So that is what the focus had to be during.
So has the government done enough in your view to try and address that issue, especially to ensure that people can survive at the end and through this lockdown?
Right. So what needed to be done? Well, it all had to do with liquidity, lending. Well, where it has, I would say, where there is still a little problem is this legal asymmetry. I don't think people have still understood something I've been saying for the last month, that this legal asymmetry creates problems for many companies, and some state governments were adding to it by insisting that all firms must pay 100% of wages to 100% of their workers. Now, the RBI and government have been working closely. I mean, the last 2-3 meetings I have attended of economists with the RBI, I think both are fully aware that monetary and fiscal policy in such a situation has to work closely. And one of the key recent issues, which was addressed in this the last statement of the finance minister, was that even though RBI had provided enough liquidity across the economy, there were some areas where the risk perception had increased so much that the banks were not lending. So I think this whole guarantee thing is something I'm very happy with, because this is something which theoretically I did 20 years ago.
Okay. So Professor Vikram Gandhi, sitting where you are at the Harvard Business School, when you look at the Indian package, Arvind Virmani makes the point, don't call it a stimulus package, but an economic relief package. How does this compare with countries worldwide? So far, the government was being accused of not having done enough. A lot of the banks and brokerages, when they've done their calculations, say the total fiscal impact of Stimulus 2.0 as well adds up to less than 1% or just about 1% of the Indian GDP. Has the government done enough? How does this compare in a global context? Professor Gandhi.
Yeah, thank you, Rahul. Thanks for having me. So, I guess I'm not an economist, so I'm kind of flattered to be part of this esteemed group. So I'll give you an answer from kind of a practitioner perspective, from an investor perspective. In addition to teaching at Harvard, I do advise a bunch of investors, the key one being the Canadian pension plan, which has a major exposure in India and will continue to look at it as a long-term opportunity. So with that kind of in context, I would say that the positives, and while I understand your point about the fact that the house is on fire, et cetera, the fact of the matter is that some of the reforms that were announced in this package were excellent. And whether they were not done before because of political problems, et cetera, to take advantage of this and make it happen, or at least announce it, is very, very positive. So that's one. I think two is this MSME liquidity issue, as Arvind pointed out, is a huge plus. It's actually very, very required. And so I would kind of say that's a big plus too. I do agree with Arvind, though, that all the stimulus packages that have happened everywhere else, I mean, I'm calling it stimulus because that's what your program says, is that it's not really stimulus. It's actually life-saving mechanisms, life-saving of companies and life-saving of people. I mean, if you look at what's happened in the U.S., every citizen below a certain income level gets $1,200 in their pocket. Every business below a certain size level is given basically a grant to keep their employees. And so there's true fiscal stimulus going in terms of checks being written. So I think that in terms of the MSME is critical. Though I do think in terms of saving the liquidity issue in the near term, perhaps more could be done. One example which kind of flushes me, which I'd love to hear, Sanjeev's perspective on, is this whole issue that liquidity is an issue. Why does not the government basically pay people on time? I was just reading this, 5.5 lakh crores, nearly $70 billion of delayed payments or payments not made on time to MSMEs. And that is actually only MSMEs, doesn't include large corporates. I'm quite involved in the nonprofit sector in India too. Some of the people I talk to who execute government programs don't get paid on time. I mean, pay them on time. I mean, yes, I can understand in a regular kind of situation that, you as a customer, you try and squeeze people for your benefit. But this is an emergency. The house is on fire. So that would be kind of an easy fix. So
okay, let's Sanjeev Sanyal respond. It's interesting that the Harvard professor raises this point, because when it was mentioned amongst the various list of things the government would do, there's a lot of mirth in the international press. They're saying, hey, this is government due, which the government has to return to these small companies, making it seem as if you'll make it a big deal by just returning money which is due to them in any case. Sanjeev Sanyal, respond to
It's not returning money. It's basically paying them for services delivered, and it's already at the expense of the government. So this is not even extra fiscal. So I think there should be more fiscal, and the response has been, at least my understanding, is that, hey, if we actually put money in the hands of people, it's not going to have the multiplier impact. So as long as you think you're putting money in the hands of people so that they don't die, that's great. But at some point, you're going to have to move from that level to getting money in the people so that spending starts occurring and the economy starts kind of getting back on track. So I would say those are the two things and it gets down to execution. Even the big, broad kind of things that are reform in the longer term. The problem I have is that some of them were actually announced before too. And if I, again, as a representative of an investor, this ease of doing business, let's do this, it's getting easier and easier. It's actually, yes, some of it is, but not a lot of it is not. And capital does not need to come to India. There are lots of other opportunities out there. So the issue really is that it's one of the things of announcing big things, which is great. It's then taking that to actually executing them on the ground. And I think that's where...
You flung many curveballs towards Sanjeev. Let's have him take them one by one. You've made big dramatic announcements in the past. International investors now want to see action on those tall claims. Sanjeev Sanyal, what's different this time around?
So let me say that his point on payments is well taken. And of course, the government should be making those payments. And I think the finance minister herself has made the point that the payments schedule should be smoothened out and payments should be made, including, by the way, on tax refunds from the central government, which are not a part, by the way, many people think that this is a part of the 20 lakh crore calculation, but even if they are not, this payment needs to be made and made soon. However, a lot of the problem happened at the state level as well. So a lot of the payment delays are at the state level, but again, no excuses here. The payments do need to be made on time. And this point well taken, because in the end,
these are big numbers, right?
Yeah. So that I do not argue again. And in any case, the point here is all the things that we are doing is ultimately aimed at what? Essentially maintaining cash flow in the economy. So making payments is one way of doing it. Creating liquidity through government guarantees and getting credit going is another way of doing it. And even transfers where we have done it. Maybe not up to your taste, but we have done significant direct transfers as well. That too can be done. By the way, this architecture of being able to do these direct transfers was a creation largely of this government. So it's not like it is shy of using it. But at the same time, you have to remember, simply using up your ammunition all at one time when you have a long run to run is perhaps not a good idea. Secondly, simply saying that let's take all of it and put it through DBT. Well, it will provide a one-time help in terms of getting people cash in their bank accounts, let's say. But that will not get the economy going because in an
but it will help them survive. One second. I know that all of you have handled a lot of money in the past and some even at the present, but the principal charge is that you've got people who are, and can I just play out some clips that it puts this conversation in context. This is what Sanjeev, just 1 second, 1 minute, just sit back because it will really throw open the challenge that we are dealing with. This is what people at this moment are dealing with. That's the expectation they have from the government. Let's show you just some clips of some of the migrants and the struggle that they're going through.
पानी मिल रहा है ना रोटी मिल रहा है हम लोग क्या भूखे मर जाए अब मुश्किल तो है अब क्या करें बीमारी की वजह से अभी कुछ कमरे में मरे जिस अच्छे रास्ते में मरे तो कुछ भी सुविधा नहीं मिला हम लोग भूखे मर जाएंगे यहाँ कोरोना से पहले इसलिए हम लोग सरकार से विनती करते तो हमें राशि भेजते मुजफ्फरपुर बच ही सकते हैं भूख से तो नहीं बचेंगे ना मरना ही पड़ेगा दूसरा कोई ऑप्शन नहीं है
खाना पहुंच पा रहा है आप खाना
नहीं पहुंच पा रहा है
पैसे भी नहीं है
नहीं
घर पे कौन कौन है बिहार में
मेरी माँ है मेरा अब्बा है मेरी बहन है मेरे छोटी छोटी 2 बहनें हैं
घर जाना चाह रहे हैं
जी
So there are lakhs of people who are thirsting, they are hungry, they say they're on the verge of having to commit suicide or take very strong action because they simply don't have the means to go by. Now, all of what you're saying is correct, but from what I heard from Raghuram Rajan, he said 65,000 crores, which is less than 5% of the package, is what it will take to have some form of a cash transfer, whether it's 5,000 rupees, 7,500 rupees given to these poor people, which will help them get by at this point in time. Mr. Sanyal, could the means not have been found to push this through, sir?
So look, we all feel sorry for these people. There is no doubt about the fact that there are fellow Indians should not have to face this situation. I don't think there is any two views on the matter. However, also be clear that we are transferring these things. The problem is there are people who drop through the cracks in this. So, for example, since you raised this issue and you showed this in the video, let me tell you, supposing we do transfer a large amount more out of this, it's not going to help the people that you have just looked at, because they, for a variety of reasons, are not there maybe in the Jan Dhan or are unable to get grains where it's being made available. Doubling up on the same channels is not going to help the case, because it will mean that people who already have some resources will have some more resources. By the way, they're all poor people, so I'm not unhappy about doing this. But the fact of the matter is it won't reach to the people that you have just highlighted. So we need to find other ways of reaching out to them. So simply doubling up on the same channel over and over again is not going to be at all useful. So what we have to do is to find other channels of doing so. So, for example, we do need to create ways for them to get home. The railways is running these special trains so that at least they don't have to, in this heat, have to walk. You have had many states, including, for example, right next door in Uttar Pradesh, large numbers of buses are being used to take people back home. So a lot of other arrangements also need to be made, which physically need to be made. So this idea that you can do this top-down transfer and solve this problem is not true, because we have transferred a significant amount of money. There are jobs for them back, Manrega jobs for them back in their village, but they are falling through the cracks. So the point is...
Dr. Virmani, do you agree with this logic that a lot of the urban migrants, the laborers, are not part of any existing government direct transfer, unlike farmers in rural India, and therefore to find a leak-proof way of targeting them, benefiting them is very difficult. There would have been huge amounts of leakages and complications in execution, which is why the government said it's better to get them on the Manrega rolls once they go back to their village, so that they have work, so that they have employment, rather than trying to give them a handout, cash handout. Dr. Virmani.
So I have long recommended, at least for 10 years, a mobile-based direct cash transfer system, because it gives money in the hand, literally in the hand, through a mobile payment system, mobile account, Aadhaar linked. But, given that this was not in place, though steps have been taken, I don't think it was in place to the extent that you could, especially the migrants. I think within 6 months you could have reached, but that requires great cooperation from the states. If the states and center had together done it, they could have reached the people who are immobile. But getting the migrants who are moving back and forth would, at this time when everything is closed, is inherently very difficult.
Dr. Rathin, do you buy that argument that Sanjeev Sanyal makes, that trying to find a way of successfully target... So he's saying, yes, the government cares for these migrants, don't think that we don't, but finding an effective, foolproof way of giving them the cash in their hands that they benefit and it doesn't leak like earlier is very difficult. That's why this wasn't an advisory.
No, it's not a question of leakage. It's a question they are physically moving. You have to register them. You have to find a way to give them the wheat or rice as they move along the road. So it's not a question of leakage. That's complete red herring. I'm sorry.
So exactly right. I think, let me make the point. You are raising an absolute red herring. The fact is, what are we trying to do? In the cities where these migrants would have been, we are supplying them with food. I think Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman also came out with a package, and she mentioned this specifically. So the Finance Minister has created channels of getting physically food to these migrants in the cities. They also have a way of doing it back in their villages. The problem is, while they are migrating, how do you actually supply it to them? So this is the reason this is a real problem. The one thing can be done is to help them get back to their village quickly. The other thing that you can do is try and maintain them back in their place of work through supporting all these various small and medium enterprises and others. And we have, of course, requested the larger corporate sector as well to try and maintain them where they are, pay their salaries and so on. So the problem breakdown happens when they are in this movement stage. And that is exactly what we wanted to avoid, but it is happening anyway. So we need
the point that you didn't respond to was the question that Vikram Gandhi asked about big talk that the world has heard in the past from India. He said global money doesn't need to come to India. There are plenty of other avenues for money to go. They've heard this from India in the past. They're getting a bit fatigued. How do we know that this time the government will walk on the talk about structural changes in land, labor, and administrative reform?
So the only way to do it is to walk the talk. There's no better demonstration than actually doing it. And we are. So we have already begun, as you know, we have been put together, we have just put together something about privatization, which Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman announced that we will now essentially privatize most PSUs that are not in strategic sectors. Even within strategic sectors, we will, for most things, allow private sector in. So this is the first time we have had a clear, unapologetic sort of expression of private.
So I want to go across now to the chief economists of Citibank and HSBC and get their perspective, starting with Samiran Chakraborty on the signal the government has given on long-term structural reform and how this is being looked at in Citibank and in your view by your clients globally at a time of great crisis. Talk of structural change. How do you think that's being processed?
Thanks, Rahul, for having me. I think the way most clients have been approaching this is that a large part of these reform measures are nothing new. We have known about it for a while. But when the government reiterates these reforms at a time like this, it's a particular signaling device that which direction the government wants to push the economy. And in that context, the ones that I will particularly want to highlight is the reforms with respect to agriculture. I think it's hitting the nail on its head that getting the maximum value addition for the farmer and better price discovery. I think that's the way to go, and getting more private sector into agriculture. I think if we implement these ideas over the next few months, it will be a massive change in things. The area where I think there is frustration is that compared to the expectations, I would say almost high expectations that markets had about reforms with respect to manufacturing and financial sector, in particular the huge asset quality issues that are going to be generated after this crisis in the financial system, how the government is planning to address those issues. I think the announcements have not gone too far ahead on those lines. I think that's where you see the divergence between an economist lens at looking at things versus the market lens at looking at things. As an economist, I'm quite happy about what I'm seeing, but maybe the markets wanted a bit more in a different direction, which has not yet come.
Is HSBC and is everyone you're talking to enthused about the government's signal on long-term structural reform? Are they buying that there is genuine intent, or do you think sab hawa mein?
Well, thank you, Rahul. I think this package was always meant to be a very balanced decision because there are just so many conflicting objectives at this point. But building on what Samiran said, I do think that the supply side reforms that have been mentioned are a good idea. Like many other countries in which the supply side is very smooth, and if there's a slowdown, all you need to do is give a fiscal stimulus and demand will come up and everything will be fine again. India is different. Here, if you give a stimulus and demand comes up, but it meets the wall of supply side constraints, then growth will actually fall back further. So I think the government has had this idea in mind, and I like it. But I think the only problem is that we've seen this movie before, We've heard about, so much of privatization, agricultural reforms, also commercial coal mining. I think it would have been a better idea had they attached some timelines to all the reforms that they spoke about. I think that would have got...
Dr. Rathin Roy, is this a big concern on your part as well, that ye to movie dekhi hui hai? We heard all these announcements, grand talk, a lot of it was mentioned in previous budgets and in previous policy papers. It didn't get acted on so far, and therefore there is a lack of credibility on whether that talk will translate into action, Dr. Roy.
There is a logic to the remarkable lack of detail. Look, if you look at the track record of this government or any government on reforms, it's not exactly salutary. So, in an Oliver Twist fashion, the government tries again. It's unwilling to commit, especially administrators in the government. I do not think this is an Economist package, by the way. It reeks of administration and covering one's tracks. 20% of the announcement made were in the future continuous tense. हम करेंगे. ये तो मैंने बहुत सुना है, लेकिन मैं ये भी देख चुका हूं कि आप कर नहीं चुके हैं. कितने जगहों पे नहीं कर चुके हैं. Obvious argument है इससे. I'm completely sympathetic with the government. I know what the bandwidth of government is. My only puzzle is that if these are things that you wanted to announce, why did it take 2 months? And as far as the migrant labor issue is concerned, I do want to come back to that. So I don't think people who are lacking for food at VT railway station in Bombay, or people who are lacking for food a few kilometers outside Delhi, it should not be not in the wit of government how to provide relief at least. I'm not talking about, it's the government who said, oh, we want to do wonderful things like transfer money to the bank accounts, take credit for that, fine. But there's a relief issue here. And that relief issue could well have been addressed by the state governments, but the state governments have not been getting the kind of targeted money for relief except for one tranche from the National Disaster Relief Fund in the future. In any case, it doesn't matter. Because what I'm hearing is that this kind of suffering that you're saying, and they're probably right, will not matter in the long run. Some people are going to suffer, it's a great pity. As Sanjeev said, we're all Indians, we're very sorry for them. But I do think it was the duty of government to provide relief, and I do see a bit of application of responsibility there. I'll be very straight with you. On the rest of what Sanjeev said, I think I completely agree with him, but what he cannot say perhaps, and I will say, is that everyone knows that government bandwidth and execution capability is low.
Okay, so Sanjeev, Sanyal, take that head on. The fact that you haven't put any dates, you haven't put any commitments, you spoke very generally of land, labor reform without explaining the blueprint. Therefore, the sense of deja vu that this is a movie we've seen.
So all I can say here is that no amount of deadlines will also help you. So, the blueprint was very clearly put together by the Prime Minister. He spoke about an Atmanirbhar Bharat and what that really meant. We have followed that up with 5 days of announcements. Now, obviously, announcing it is an announcement, and you have yourself said that it's not credible until it's done. So
how is Atmanirbhar Bharat different from what we've been hearing on Make in India for so many years?
So obviously, we need to begin to implement them. And yes, Atmanirbhar Bharat has, of course, a very strong element of Make in India. And incidentally, a lot of things have happened on Make in India. I don't know why it is assumed in rhetoric that nothing has happened. I mean, India basically didn't produce any mobile phones till 3 years ago. By last year, we were the world's second largest producer. So there are many areas where Make in India has succeeded. To just say that it hasn't succeeded as a generic statement is not factually correct. Maybe we could have done more, but we have not. It is not an unsuccessful strategy. Secondly, we do have a peculiar opportunity here of really inserting ourselves into global supply chains, something that the Prime Minister emphasized repeatedly, Finance Minister has hinted at as well, and we are backing it with major reforms. I mean, labor reforms already being announced in several states. You've already seen many other things being done. I mean, agricultural reforms, Samiran mentioned, and there are long lists of them, and many being done at the state level as well. It's not just the central government that's done.
So let's build on this. The government says this is a big opportunity to insert ourselves into global supply chains. It talks about the idea of Atmanirbhar Bharat, a self-reliant Bharat. Professor Vikram Gandhi, do you see a contradiction between the desire for self-reliance and the desire to be inserted in the global value supply chain?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I take Sanjeev's point here quite well, in the sense that, you know, it was kind of surprising that when this GST thing was announced, etc., there were people criticizing it that, oh, this reform has been done too quickly, you know, we didn't think about all the execution issues, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it was the first time I actually heard in India that reform was done too fast. And so I do take the point that, you know, it's easy for everyone to just throw rocks at the government, but I think it has done a lot. I mean, take the electronics industry, like you mentioned. I mean, Samsung has just shut down its factory in China and moving its largest factory to Noida. And that whole Korean ecosystem and the Noida ecosystem has been built around the electronics industry, which started just as a kind of assembling unit, essentially. So I think a lot has been done, and I think this actually, while made in India was a big headline, you know, and things were moving away from China. You could see that basically when things started moving from China, they went to Vietnam and some of the other Southeast Asian countries because people still had a rough time doing business in India. So I think it actually creates a massive opportunity. And I think the government is right in focusing on it, but I just get back to this issue of execution, execution, execution. And the one thing I would say, if I just take an analogy from the business world, is that when you have large strategies and policies and visions, the way you bring your stakeholders, your employees, your customers, your shareholders, everybody else along is by showing some really early high-profile wins. And so I would encourage the government that rather than trying, you know, announcing all this is great, focus on 2 or 3 things and make it happen and show big picture wins. And I think that's what actually gets the momentum going.
What, according to you, would be a tangible big picture win which will send an electrifying current globally and especially to those companies that are looking at moving manufacturing out of China?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, yes, I am.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, again, you should fix that with the policy side. So where ultimately this is about job creation. And the 2 places that job creation can happen the most is spending on infrastructure and getting the supply chain or the made in China piece over here. So it's really the industries. I mean, you know, auto parts have become, I think, alternative energy. There are so many areas in terms of both the manufacturing side where global supply, pharmaceuticals, I mean, you can go down the list. It's not just one industry. There are 5 or 6 key industries which are key employers. Now, one of the big industries, which is 10% of the GDP of the world, is tourism. And that has been crushed. And how it comes back or doesn't come back, I don't know. But that's one of the big holes, which again, I mean, maybe tourism will come back, maybe not to the extent. But again, you know, India has less tourists historically than Bangkok. And so I think it's just, there are so many little opportunities like that, but identify 2 or 3 and go for it.
Dr. Arvind Virmani, has enough been done to save jobs? The report from the Center for the Monitoring of Indian Economy for the month of April said 100 million plus people were rendered jobless just in the month of April alone. Does this economic relief package, in your view, do enough to try and ensure that we save as many jobs as we possibly can?
See, you know, you have to look at the economy, I keep emphasizing, in 3 phases. One is the lockdown phase, the other is the transition towards normalcy, and some kind of a normal thing where normal policies can be discussed. I think what is happening is that people are stuck in their old world and just emphasizing the things they've always emphasized. Now, has been done. The estimates we produce show that the 55% of employment is that 40% of the GVA, which is in essential commodities, 55% of the employment is there. The sectors which Professor just talked about constitute about 10% of GVA and 10% of employment. And then is the manufacturing, mining, agriculture, and associated services, which is about 50% of the economy, but only 35% of employment. Now, the question is, of course, people are running ahead and thinking on the future, which is a good thing. But the point is, right now, what had to be done is to save mass bankruptcy. Because if these firms go out, they will not be there to produce employment when the transition occurs or when we go to something resembling normalcy. And in that direction, I think that thinking has been correct. Now, one can always say there were some mistakes made. There were mistakes made, but I don't think it was based on just sitting at home and thinking up things of themselves. No, let me tell you one. Yeah.
No, but
so has enough been done employment? Well, in the next phase, as we come out of the lockdown, this part of the economy, which I just mentioned, the manufacturing mining sector, has to be revived. And the key problem there is, again, not going to be demand. It is going to be geographical fragmentation of markets. It's going to be that you will get demand supply imbalances in goods, in workers, in credit, in working capital, etc. That's where the focus has to be, to make sure these supply chains of mining, manufacturing, construction, and the associated services. What are associated services? The goods have to move. The workers have to move to the factories. Those are the things you have to focus on in the next stage. And I hope, Sanjeev is there, I hope they are beginning to focus on those.
No, but when you speak to corporate India,
not some aggregate demand.
Sanjeev, Sanyal, here's the point they make, that the government has focused a lot on ensuring that small companies especially have adequate access to credit to be able to stay afloat. But they're saying, will a small businessman want to produce if demand is uncertain? If he doesn't know whether there are enough and more people wanting to purchase the product he produces, will he still be enthused about getting his factories running again? Many people are saying, let's wait and watch. And therefore, they're saying, till you address the issue of demand more substantially, all the credit that we are providing doesn't by itself get the economy's engine up and running.
So just like Dr. Virmani just said, we have to make sure that the supply side stays alive to the other side of this lockdown. There is no point in putting in a huge amount of demand if you've got a gridlocked business sector with cascades of defaults that have happened. So we have to avoid these cascades of demand and our financial system getting gridlocked, because then nothing will matter. You can just, if you provide more demand under that circumstance, you'll basically get inflation, because there is no supply side response that is possible. So it's very, very important that you avoid that happening. So if you look at the kinds of things we have done, that is systematically to avoid this cascade of default, a gridlocking of the cash flows. So a lot of effort has been put in really to do that. So when you look at the government guarantees or the SPV as a buyer of last resort for NBFC paper and so on and so forth, a lot of this is about trying to avoid this. Because if we do not do that, then you will have to, you'll go into a spiral of trying to provide ever more, direct transfers, etc., to the increasing unemployed people. So this is certainly not the direction we want to go down. So you have to protect the MSME sector, the financial sector. The larger corporates also need support, by the way, but they are better able to raise things from the market.
So Samiran, Chakraborty, do you agree with this assessment? Because a lot has been written in the pink papers and a lot of opinion pieces as well on how the issue of generating demand hasn't been fully addressed. Until the time you do that, there's no way you can find yourself walking out of the trouble that we're in right now.
So in our view, it's more of a survival package than a revival package at this point of time. And that's where I think the markets will keep their hope that a revival package is in the making at some point of time. That will also come. Because one of the challenges that is there.
No, but one thing that this package shows, Samiran, is the government doesn't believe that it has a lot of headroom for more packages of this nature. Because at the end of it, if you look at the crosstab of all the agencies, the average seems to be about 1% of the GDP, which means the government obviously constrained.
Let me actually dispute you on this.
No, you don't have to dispute me. These are all the other analysts. They've done the math. I'll put that on the screen.
On this, there are several points here which are factually don't make sense from your own statement.
Okay.
First of all, that why should we only account for a stimulus purely in terms of government spending? A government guarantee is also a very important part of a stimulus. In a country where monetary and credit space is much larger, we should clearly use monetary and credit space. Why shouldn't we use it? Why should that not be calculated as a... By the way, in most countries, the monetary and credit stimulus and guarantees have been included in their as well. Now comes the issue, the very fact that the peculiar way in which you want to define a stimulus also means that we have space to do more. In other words, we have conserved ammunition for the time when we go into rebuilding. I think the finance minister herself has made this point, that you cannot use up all your ammunition in one shot. we will have to conserve some for the time when we are in rebuild phase. But in order to be able to spend, then one, we have to restrain ourselves to some extent. Two, very importantly, you have to make sure that this supply side survives to the other side of this, because even if we keep all our ammo dry at the other end of it and fire it, will no use if the supply side has jammed up on you.
Pranjal Bhandari, do you buy that argument from the government that we've kept things tight so that there is headroom and space available for more stimulus as we move from the survival phase to the rebuilding phase?
Right. So, this is how I think about growth from here. We'll definitely have a growth and even a jobs problem through this year and perhaps for longer. But things will perhaps improve a little bit over the next couple of weeks or next couple of months, because we are moving away from an extreme lockdown to a small lockdown, to an easier sort of economy. As I think Dr. Virmani was saying, that about 30-35% of the economy was working in March, and now about 70% of the economy is likely to work from next month onwards. That in itself will create a lot of demand. Most importantly, pent-up consumption demand. The fact that I was not able to go and buy the things I wanted to buy, now I can go and buy it, and the retailer will have to restock, and therefore the manufacturer will have to manufacture. So the next couple of months, I think, will be good from that sense. But the problem is after that. Once that wave of demand goes away, then what's going to support growth? And I think at that point, we'll really have to think about, perhaps another package, or some other schemes. Our only hope at that point perhaps could be that if some of the supply side reforms do happen, and there is some positive sentiment about medium-term growth potential, that in itself may attract some risk capital into the economy and alleviate some funding issues. But we are in a tight situation.
Okay, you've done well so far, Sanjeev. I have one last googly coming your way. Have you started working on Stimulus 6.0 already? Is that why you're sounding so confident that there will be more announcements soon?
There is obviously a question only the finance minister can answer. Let me say it's her prerogative to answer that, but we do have the space both on the fiscal side, but even more on the monetary side, to provide a lot more support to demand if necessary. And I'm sure we will be doing more into the future. But as I said, it's up to the finance minister to announce what that will be, when that will be, and how it will be.
So we've had an engaging conversation. There's been very different perspectives on offer, and I'm very delighted that Sanjeev Sanyal, Rathin Roy, Professor Vikram, Gandhi, Pranjal Bhandari, Arvind, Virmani and Samiran Chakraborty could take out time for this Jumpstart 2.0, deconstructing the government's financial package. Thank you. You can get some water. Sit back, Sanjeev. You did well. Thank you. And thanks to all our guests for joining us for this special conversation. I hope you enjoyed this as well. This was Jumpstart 2.0. We'll have more for you in a couple of days. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. We'll have more on the other side of a very quick break. Stay with us.
मुझे मालूम था बहुत खतरा है, मुझे मालूम था